1. The disappearance of Ray Bergman. In the winter of 1973, Ray Bergman, a seasoned outdoorsman, and his friend Bill decided to hunt elk in the deep woods near Fort Kent, Maine. This area was notorious for its Wendigo legends, but to Ray, those were just campfire stories. The two friends set out early one morning, but by dusk, Ray hadn't returned to the cabin. Bill waited, assuming his friend had simply lost track of time. However, when midnight came and still no sign of Ray, Bill grew worried. The temperature had plummeted, and staying out in the cold without proper gear could be deadly. The next morning, Bill ventured into the woods to find his friend. A search party formed as the hours passed. They scoured the snow-covered landscape, following Ray's tracks for miles until they ended near a clearing. There, they found signs of a struggle, blood splattered across the snow, broken tree branches, and fragments of clothing. But there was something far more unsettling: massive footprints, larger than any animal in the area. They appeared to circle the scene before disappearing into the deeper woods. The search team couldn't explain them. Some members whispered about the Wendigo, but no one wanted to admit their fear openly. Days passed, and Ray was never found. People speculated that he had been dragged away by a bear, but those who knew the stories about the Wendigo weren't so sure. It's said that in those woods, you can still hear faint screams on cold, silent nights, as though Ray's voice was trapped in eternal agony, lost to the hunger of the Wendigo. 2. The Wendigo in Northern Ontario. In 1920, a trapper named Jack Fiddler, a chief and shaman of the Sucker people, was arrested for murdering a woman in Northern Ontario. His reasoning: he claimed she had been possessed by a Wendigo spirit and that she would soon transform into the creature, killing everyone in her path. Jack was known in his tribe for being a Wendigo hunter, having claimed to have killed at least 14 of these creatures over his lifetime. According to his people's beliefs, a person could become a Wendigo after being cursed or driven mad by the harsh winter isolation. As starvation set in, they would crave human flesh, and once they succumbed, the transformation was complete. The Wendigo spirit would then inhabit their body, using it to hunt and feed endlessly. Jack Fiddler was sentenced to prison for his crime, but the community was divided. His people believed he was doing what was necessary to protect them from a terrible fate, while the outside world saw it as nothing more than a superstitious murder. Interestingly, Jack escaped before his sentencing, but rather than running away, he hanged himself. To this day, some say Jack knew the Wendigo was close, and in taking his own life, he may have prevented something much worse from happening to the community. 3. The isolated cabin incident. In 1987, a group of college students decided to spend their winter break in a remote cabin in northern Minnesota, hoping to experience the thrill of survival in the wilderness. The locals warned them of the Wendigo, telling them not to stray too far from the cabin, especially at night. They laughed it off, chalking it up to rural superstitions. The first few days went smoothly. They chopped firewood, hunted, and drank by the fire, dismissing the eerie quiet of the woods as part of the wilderness charm. But by the fourth night, strange things began to happen. One evening, after the sun had set, one of the students, Tyler, stepped outside to gather more firewood. He didn't return. The others assumed he'd gone out to relieve himself, but after an hour passed, concern set in. They searched the area, but there was no sign of him. The only thing they found was his flashlight, still on, lying in the snow at the edge of the woods. That night, the winds howled louder than before, and strange, high-pitched wails echoed through the trees. The next morning, another one of the students, Sarah, disappeared. The others were frantic, convinced that someone or something was stalking them. They tried to leave the cabin, but the snow had piled up too high, trapping them. That night, the scratching started. It came from the walls of the cabin, a slow, deliberate scraping sound as if something large, was circling them, testing the boundaries of their shelter. By the time rescuers arrived 4 days later, only 2 of the 6 students remained. They were in a state of near catatonic shock, huddled together in a corner of the cabin, muttering incoherently about eyes in the dark and hunger. The bodies of the missing students were never recovered. The survivors refused to speak of what happened during those last nights, but locals believe they encountered a Wendigo drawn to their fear and isolation. 4. The strange case of Paul Leblanc. Paul Leblanc was a seasoned ranger in Quebec, patrolling the forests around Lac Saint Jean. In 2003, he responded to a distress call from two hunters who claimed to have found an abandoned campsite with signs of a struggle. When Paul arrived, he was greeted by an eerie scene. The campsite was torn apart, tents shredded, supplies scattered. But there was no sign of the campers themselves. The strangest part was the tracks. They appeared human at first, but as Paul followed them deeper into the woods, they became less distinct, almost as though whoever made them had begun walking on all fours. The deeper Paul ventured, the more uneasy he became. There was a smell in the air, something rotten like decaying flesh. After hours of searching, he found one of the campers, a young man named Roger, delirious and frostbitten, crouched in the snow. Roger was mumbling incoherently, speaking of a tall, thin man with eyes that glowed in the dark. His hands were covered in blood, but it wasn't his own. Roger was hospitalized but never fully recovered his sanity. He was plagued by night terrors, screaming about the Wendigo coming for him. The second camper was never found, but Paul's team found strange remains. A pile of bones gnawed clean, scattered around a fire pit. Paul never spoke of the incident again, except to say that something terrible stalks the forests of Quebec, something no man could face and survive. Locals believe the Wendigo still roams those woods, hungry for its next victim. 5. The Hunting Lodge in Alberta. In 1961, a group of 5 men set out on a hunting trip deep in the forests of Alberta, Canada. They had secured a hunting lodge that was only accessible by a long and difficult trail, hours away from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where you could disappear for weeks and no one would find you. Perfect for big game hunting, but also prime territory for something much more sinister. The first few days were successful. They hunted caribou, skinned them, and enjoyed the isolation of the forest. However, after they encountered a disturbing sight on the 3rd day, the mood shifted. While tracking a large elk, they came across an area where the ground was torn up and covered in blood, but there was no body, just massive, misshapen footprints leading into the trees. One of the hunters, Greg, joked that it was the Wendigo, a creature he had heard of from his grandfather, who grew up in the region. The others laughed it off, but there was something about Greg's tone that unnerved them. He wasn't entirely joking. His grandfather had told him stories of people who vanished in the woods, only to reappear days or weeks later, twisted and monstrous, with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. That night, something circled their lodge. They could hear heavy footsteps outside, and something scraping against the walls. Every so often, there would be a loud thud as though something large was ramming into the door. Armed with rifles, they waited, the air thick with tension. One of the men swore he saw a figure watching them from the tree line, its eyes reflecting in the firelight. When morning came, they found large claw marks on the outside of the lodge and strange, elongated footprints in the snow. Despite their fear, they decided to stay one more night, determined not to be frightened away by some animal. That night was worse. The howling began around midnight, an eerie, unnatural sound that echoed through the trees. The walls of the lodge shook, and whatever was outside seemed more aggressive. One of the men, Mike, panicked and decided to leave, convinced they were in danger. He grabbed his gear and stormed out into the night, ignoring the others' protests. The next morning, they found Mike's mutilated body not far from the lodge, his face twisted in horror, his flesh ripped apart as though by claws. His bones had been gnawed clean. They abandoned the lodge immediately, leaving behind their supplies. No one ever returned to that place, and the lodge has since been reclaimed by the forest. The remaining men refused to speak in detail about what happened, but locals still talk about the Wendigo that stalks the Alberta woods, waiting for those foolish enough to stay too long. 6. The Wendigo Curse of the Northern Rockies. In 1982, a young couple, Jake and Emily, went hiking in the Northern Rockies for their anniversary. The trip was meant to be a quiet escape from the noise of the city, just the two of them and the vast wilderness. They were warned by a park ranger not to go too deep into the forest due to recent reports of strange sightings, but they ignored the warnings, eager for solitude. On the 3rd day of their hike, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was barely standing, its roof sagging and windows shattered. Curious, they decided to explore it. Inside, they found scattered bones, some animal, some unmistakably human. There was a deep, clawed-out hole in the corner of the cabin, as though something had tried to dig its way through the floor. The air inside was thick with a rancid, rotting stench. They left the cabin quickly, but as they made their way back to camp, Emily started to feel uneasy, as if something was watching them. That night, the forest was eerily silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. Suddenly, they heard a distant, blood-curdling scream, a sound unlike anything they had ever heard. Jake tried to convince Emily it was just an animal, but the fear in his voice betrayed his words. The next morning, they found massive footprints around their camp, too large and deformed to be human, and deep claw marks on the surrounding trees. As they packed to leave, Emily noticed something was wrong with Jake. He had grown pale, and his eyes seemed hollow. He kept muttering under his breath about the hunger. As they hiked out of the woods, Jake's condition worsened. He stopped eating, his skin stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes grew wild. He would snap at Emily, barely able to control his temper. Finally, he collapsed, shaking uncontrollably. Emily, terrified, tried to drag him back to civilization, but he became violent, attacking her with a ferocity she had never seen. His teeth were sharp, his nails long and claw-like. He was no longer her husband, he had become something else. In a desperate attempt to save herself, Emily ran. She reached the ranger station 2 days later, hysterical and nearly frostbitten. A search party went out to find Jake, but all they recovered was his blood-stained clothing and massive, misshapen tracks leading deeper into the mountains. Locals believe Jake fell victim to the Wendigo curse, a fate reserved for those who venture too far into its territory. 7. The Starved Ones. In the early 1900s, a small logging camp in northern Manitoba became the site of a gruesome tragedy. The winter had come early that year, trapping the men in their camp with limited supplies. They were weeks away from the nearest town, and the deep snow made travel impossible. As food ran out, tempers flared, and the men began to grow desperate. One of the loggers, Tom, started acting strangely. He would sit by the fire, staring into the flames for hours, muttering to himself about the hunger and how it was inside him, gnawing at his insides. His fellow loggers tried to snap him out of it, but his condition worsened. One night, Tom disappeared into the woods. The others searched for him, but found nothing except his hatchet, lying in the snow, covered in blood. Over the next few days, more of the men vanished, one by one, each time leaving behind strange tracks in the snow, long, clawed footprints that seemed to stalk the camp. Finally, only 2 men remained. They'd barricaded themselves inside the cabin, but the howling wind carried voices, whispers of the Wendigo, and the sound of something scraping against the door. When help arrived in the spring, they found the cabin torn apart, the door ripped from its hinges. Inside were the bodies of the 2 remaining loggers, half-eaten, their faces frozen in terror. The tracks outside the cabin were unlike anything the rescuers had ever seen, footprints that started human but gradually transformed into something far more monstrous. The loggers who survived that winter would never speak of it again, but the legend of the Starved Ones became part of local lore. They say the Wendigo still haunts the forests of Manitoba, waiting for the next group of travelers to fall victim to the hunger. 8. The Wendigo sightings in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The dense, isolated forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula have always been a place of mystery and fear. In 1996, a local man named Hank Swanson had a run-in with what he swore was a Wendigo. Hank, an experienced outdoorsman, was used to the strange happenings of the forest, but nothing could prepare him for what he encountered that autumn. Hank was out hunting deer when he noticed an unnatural stillness in the woods. It wasn't just the absence of animals, everything seemed frozen. As he scanned the area, he noticed a figure standing at the edge of a clearing. It was tall, impossibly thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. The eyes were sunken, glowing faintly in the dim light of dusk. It stood there watching him. As Hank raised his rifle, the creature let out a long, guttural growl, like the sound of a person trying to scream through a mouthful of broken glass. Hank felt a cold wave of terror wash over him, and before he could react, the creature sprinted into the woods with unnatural speed, its limbs bending in ways that no human could. Hank fled, abandoning his hunt and swearing to never return to that part of the forest. He told his story to anyone who would listen, but most dismissed it as a hallucination or a trick of the light. However, locals have whispered about strange disappearances in that area for years, and some believe the Wendigo roams the forests, waiting for those who dare to venture too deep into its territory. 9. The Wendigo of Blackwater Creek. In 2008, a group of 4 friends from Manitoba went on a camping trip near Blackwater Creek, deep in the wilderness. It was an area known for its beauty, but also infamous for stories of strange sightings and eerie happenings. The group, however, wasn't deterred by these rumors. They had been camping many times before and assumed the stories were nothing more than folklore. The first 2 days went by uneventfully. They hiked, fished, and enjoyed their time in nature. On the 3rd night, as they sat around the campfire, the atmosphere grew tense. One of the friends, Todd, pointed out that there hadn't been any animal noises that night. No birds, no rustling in the bushes, not even the sound of the creek they were camped near. It was as if the forest had gone silent. Suddenly, they heard a distant scream. It was high-pitched, inhuman, and seemed to echo from all directions. The group fell silent, fear creeping into their hearts. They tried to dismiss it as an animal call, but deep down, they all knew something was wrong. Later that night, something approached their camp. It circled them, staying just beyond the firelight, moving with deliberate predatory stealth. The crackling of branches and the crunching of leaves was followed by a low, guttural growl. One of the friends, Jeff, grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the noise. What they saw defied explanation. At the edge of the trees, a tall, emaciated figure stood. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs were unnaturally long and thin. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the light. It stared at them for a moment, its mouth hanging open, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Without warning, the creature darted back into the woods, moving faster than any animal they had ever seen. Panicking, the group grabbed their gear and fled the campsite, leaving behind most of their belongings. They didn't stop running until they reached their car hours later. They never spoke of what they had seen, but they all knew it was the Wendigo. To this day, locals near Blackwater Creek advise campers to steer clear of that area, saying it's cursed by a malevolent presence that preys on those who linger too long. 10. The Wendigo in Saskatchewan. The year was 1935, and the winter in northern Saskatchewan was one of the harshest in decades. A small settlement in the area had become snowbound, completely cut off from the nearest town. Supplies were running low, and the people were beginning to starve. One night, a local man named Arthur went missing. His wife claimed that during dinner, he had begun acting strangely, his eyes distant and glassy. He kept muttering about the hunger, how it was gnawing at his bones. Later that night, he left the house, disappearing into the blizzard. A search party was formed, but they found no trace of Arthur. Days later, another man, John, went missing. His wife reported similar behavior, talk of hunger, madness in his eyes, and then he vanished into the snow. As the weeks dragged on, more men began to disappear. Each time, the same story repeated itself: a growing obsession with hunger, a descent into madness, and then a disappearance into the wilderness. One of the elders of the community began to whisper about the Wendigo, a creature that possessed the bodies of those on the brink of starvation, driving them to commit unspeakable acts of cannibalism. The elders warned the remaining villagers to stay inside, to keep the fires burning, and not to listen to the voices outside. Despite their precautions, the disappearances continued. Those who ventured into the forest to search for the missing men found only traces of blood in the snow and enormous footprints that led deeper into the wilderness. By the time spring arrived, nearly half of the settlement had either vanished or gone mad. Those who survived claimed the Wendigo had come for them, feeding off their desperation and starvation. The village was eventually abandoned, left to decay in the snow-covered woods. Locals still avoid the area, believing it to be cursed by the Wendigo, a place where the hungry spirit still roams. 11. The cabin at Mount Shasta. In 1974, a small group of climbers set out to scale Mount Shasta in Northern California. Among the group was a man named David, an experienced mountaineer. The climb was difficult, and by the second day, a snowstorm had swept in, forcing the group to take shelter in an old, dilapidated cabin they found on the mountain. The storm raged on for days, trapping the climbers inside. As their supplies dwindled, tensions began to rise. The cabin was small, the walls thin, and the constant howling of the wind made it feel as if something was lurking just outside. One night, David woke up to strange sounds, scratching at the door and a faint whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He shook it off as a hallucination brought on by the stress and hunger, but the next morning, one of the climbers, Mark, was missing. His sleeping bag lay untouched, and there were no signs of a struggle. The others assumed he had left the cabin to relieve himself during the night and gotten lost in the storm. As the days dragged on, the situation became more desperate. Another climber, James, began to exhibit strange behavior. He would sit by the window, staring out into the blizzard, muttering about a figure he had seen walking through the snow. He claimed it was watching them, waiting for them to leave the cabin. On the fifth night, David woke up to find James standing at the door, his face pale and gaunt. Before David could stop him, James opened the door and stepped outside into the storm. David rushed to pull him back in, but as he did, he caught a glimpse of something standing just beyond the snow, tall, thin, with glowing eyes. It disappeared into the blizzard as quickly as it had appeared. Terrified, David and the remaining climbers barricaded the door and prayed for the storm to end. When they were finally rescued a day later, the search party found no trace of Mark or James. The rescue team discovered massive footprints in the snow surrounding the cabin, larger than any human could make. The story of the Wendigo has never been linked to Mount Shasta, but David was convinced that the creature that stalked them in the storm was none other than the hunger-driven spirit. He never returned to the mountains again, haunted by the memory of what he had seen. 12. The strange case of Sam Williams. In 1959, a man named Sam Williams disappeared while hunting in the dense forests of Ontario. He was an experienced woodsman and tracker known for his ability to survive in the wild. When he didn't return after several days, a search party was sent out to look for him. They found his campsite undisturbed, but Sam was nowhere to be seen. His rifle was propped up against a tree, his pack still full of supplies. There were no signs of a struggle, just his tracks leading off into the trees, and then abruptly stopping. Weeks went by, and Sam was presumed dead. But then, nearly a month later, he stumbled into a small town, emaciated and delirious. His clothes were torn, and his skin was frostbitten. He could barely speak, mumbling about a thing in the woods that had been following him. Sam was taken to the hospital, but he never fully recovered. He would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming about the Wendigo, about how it had whispered to him, promising to ease his hunger if he just gave in. When asked what had happened to him, Sam could only repeat one phrase. I ate. I ate. He died a few weeks later, his body wasted away as if something had drained the life out of him. The locals whispered that Sam had been taken by the Wendigo, consumed by its curse. Though no one knew for sure what had happened during the weeks he was missing, the legend of the Wendigo grew stronger in that region, a warning to all who ventured too deep into the wilderness. 13. The Wendigo haunting of Duluth. In 1989, a family from Duluth, Minnesota, decided to spend their Christmas holiday in a cabin near Lake Superior. The family, consisting of John, his wife Linda, and their teenage daughter Emma, was hoping for a quiet, peaceful retreat far from the chaos of the city. But instead, they'd found something far more sinister lurking in the woods. The first night in the cabin passed uneventfully, though Emma claimed she had heard scratching noises outside her window. Her parents dismissed it as nothing more than a branch scraping against the cabin's walls. On the second night, John woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow outside. Peering through the frosted window, he saw a large, gaunt figure standing at the tree line. It was unnaturally tall, and its eyes glowed a faint yellow in the moonlight. John grabbed his rifle and opened the door, but by the time he stepped outside, the figure had disappeared into the woods. The next morning, they found strange, elongated footprints leading away from the cabin, but no sign of any human or animal. That night, the noises grew louder, scratching, growling, and something thumping against the walls. The family huddled together, terrified. They called the local authorities, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of the creature. The only evidence left behind was deep claw marks etched into the wood of the cabin. The authorities dismissed it as a bear attack, but John knew better. He recognized the signs from old stories his grandfather had told him about the Wendigo, how it stalked its victims, tormenting them for days before finally dragging them into the wilderness. The family left the cabin the next day, but even back in Duluth, John couldn't shake the feeling that the Wendigo was still watching them, waiting for its chance to strike. To this day, locals claim the area around Lake Superior is haunted by a Wendigo, a spirit that preys on those who dare to isolate themselves in the wilderness during the harsh winter months. 14. The Wendigo of Pine Barrens. In 2014, two brothers, David and Robert, went on a hunting trip deep in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. Although the area is better known for the legend of the Jersey Devil, the dense, foreboding woods also have their fair share of Wendigo sightings, though most are never discussed openly. The brothers had been hunting for several days without much luck. Late one afternoon, they noticed a herd of deer in the distance. As they crept closer, they realized something was wrong. One of the deer had been savagely torn apart, its body mutilated in a way that no animal could have done. They found massive claw marks on the carcass and what looked like human teeth marks on the bones. Suddenly, the wind shifted and a foul stench filled the air, a mix of decay and rot. Both brothers felt a sense of overwhelming dread wash over them. As they turned to leave, they heard branches snapping and the sound of something large crashing through the forest. They hurried back to their camp, but the feeling of being watched never left them. That night, as they sat around the fire, the forest fell eerily silent. No insects, no birds, just the crackling of the fire. Out of nowhere, they heard a distant scream like someone or something was in terrible pain. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. The brothers grabbed their rifles, but by the time they stood up, whatever was making the noise had stopped. The next morning, they'd found their camp completely destroyed. Their supplies were scattered, their tents slashed, and deep, human-like footprints surrounded the campsite. Terrified, they packed up and left, vowing never to return to the Pine Barrens. Locals in the area believe the Wendigo resides deep in the barrens, hiding in the shadows and preying on those who venture too far from civilization. Though most people associate the woods with the Jersey Devil, those who know the old stories understand that something far darker and more malevolent haunts those woods. 15. The Hungry Ghosts of Manitoba. In the remote regions of Manitoba, Canada, where winters can last for months and the cold can kill in hours, Wendigo stories are taken very seriously. In 1957, a man named James Blackfeather, a member of the Cree Nation, recounted a horrifying experience his grandfather had with the Wendigo. James' grandfather, Chief Redfeather, lived in a small village near Lake Winnipeg. One winter, a group of trappers from the village went missing after heading north in search of better game. Weeks passed with no word, and the village feared the worst. Finally, one of the men, Daniel, returned, barely alive. He was frostbitten, delirious, and starving, but he refused to speak of what had happened to the others. As Daniel recovered, strange things began to happen. He would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, talking about a presence that had followed him back from the wilderness. He claimed that his fellow trappers had succumbed to hunger and madness, turning on each other in a desperate bid to survive. Eventually, Daniel revealed the horrifying truth. After days without food, the men had resorted to cannibalism, eating the flesh of their dead companions. But as they did, something changed. The spirit of the Wendigo took hold of them, warping their bodies and minds. By the time Daniel fled, the men were no longer human. They had become Wendigos, driven by an insatiable hunger for flesh. As the weeks went by, Daniel's condition worsened. He became increasingly erratic, often speaking in a voice that was not his own. One night, he disappeared into the snowstorm, never to be seen again. The elders of the village believed that the Wendigo had claimed him, taking his soul and leaving behind nothing but hunger. The villagers sealed off the area where the trappers had vanished, and it remains forbidden to this day. They say the Wendigo still roams those woods, hungry for more souls to consume. No one dares go near Lake Winnipeg in the dead of winter, for fear of encountering the Wendigo's deadly curse. 16. The Wendigo of the Northwest Territories. In 1963, an isolated Inuit community in the Northwest Territories faced an unimaginable terror. The winter had been harsh, and the hunting had been poor, leaving the community dangerously low on food. As starvation loomed, tensions grew. It was then that a young man named Nanook began to show signs of what the elders feared the most: Wendigo possession. Nanook became withdrawn, refusing to eat or sleep. His skin turned pale, and his eyes grew wild, as if he was seeing something no one else could. He began muttering about the hunger, claiming it was inside him, that it was driving him mad. The elders knew the signs. The Wendigo was near. One night, Nanook disappeared into the wilderness. The community searched for him for days, but all they found were his clothes, torn and bloodstained, scattered across the snow. But that wasn't the worst of it. Near his clothes, they found massive, clawed footprints, larger than any animal native to the area. Fearing the Wendigo had claimed Nanook, the elders held a ceremony to cleanse the area and protect the village from further harm. However, the sightings didn't stop. People began hearing strange noises at night, scratching at their doors, growling from the shadows, and whispers carried on the icy wind. To this day, the Inuit of the Northwest Territories speak of the Wendigo with a mix of fear and reverence. They say that once the Wendigo takes hold of a person, they are lost forever, consumed by an endless, gnawing hunger that can never be sated. 17. The curse of the Wendigo in northern Quebec. In 1972, a logging crew working in the dense forests of northern Quebec experienced something that left them scared for life. The crew had been working for weeks in a remote area, far from any civilization, when strange things began happening. Tools went missing, food supplies were mysteriously destroyed, and at night they heard distant screams echoing through the trees. One of the loggers, Pierre, told the others about the Wendigo legend, warning them that they were in its territory. The crew laughed at him, dismissing the story as an old wives' tale. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences grew more frequent. Pierre grew increasingly paranoid, refusing to leave the camp alone, and always carrying a rifle with him. One night, one of the loggers, Jen, vanished without a trace. The others searched for him, but all they found were his boots, abandoned in the snow. The next morning, Pierre was found dead, his body twisted and contorted in an unnatural way, as if something had broken him from the inside. The remaining loggers packed up and fled the area, never returning to the site. Some believed it was just a series of tragic accidents, but others, including Pierre's family, were convinced that the Wendigo had claimed the men. 18. The Wendigo of Elk River. In the winter of 1994, a lone trapper named Joseph Wallace disappeared in the deep forests near Elk River, Montana. Joseph was a seasoned outdoorsman, familiar with the rugged terrain and unpredictable weather. His cabin, miles away from the nearest town, was his sanctuary during the winter months. But that winter, something stalked him through the trees. Joseph had gone out to check his traps when he noticed something strange. All the animals had been torn apart, not eaten, just savagely killed. The footprints around the traps weren't those of a wolf or a bear. They were long, clawed, and far too large to belong to any known animal. As the days went by, Joseph began to feel like he was being watched. No matter where he went, the forest was unnervingly quiet. One night, Joseph woke to the sound of heavy breathing outside his cabin. At first, he thought it might be a bear, but when he looked out the window, he saw a tall, skeletal figure standing at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The creature didn't move, just stood there, staring at him with a hunger that chilled Joseph to the bone. For the next 3 nights, the Wendigo appeared outside the cabin, coming closer each time. By the 4th night, Joseph's firewood was running low, and the creature was at his door. His last entry in his journal, found months later, simply read, "It's here." Joseph's body was never recovered, but his cabin showed signs of a violent struggle. Massive claw marks covered the walls, and the door had been ripped off its hinges. Those who found the cabin say they felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the Wendigo was still lingering nearby, waiting for its next victim. 19. The missing children of Devil's Pass. In 2001, 2 young children went missing in an area known as Devil's Pass, near Thunder Bay, Ontario. The children, siblings aged 8 and 10, had been playing in the woods near their home when they vanished without a trace. A massive search effort was launched, but days passed with no sign of the kids. Their parents were devastated, and the community was shaken by the disappearance. Several days into the search, the lead tracker, a local man named Henry, found something disturbing. Deep in the forest, Far from where the children were last seen, he discovered small footprints, human but mixed with larger, clawed prints. The footprints led into an area that locals had long warned people to avoid, an area where strange lights had been seen at night and eerie sounds echoed through the trees. The search team followed the tracks to a clearing where they found remnants of clothing and toys belonging to the children. However, they found no bodies. Instead, they discovered deep claw marks on the trees surrounding the clearing, as if something had been stalking the children. Henry, having grown up hearing tales of the Wendigo, knew what had happened. He believed the creature had taken the children, drawn by their fear and vulnerability. The search was called off soon after, and the area was declared off-limits. To this day, locals avoid Devil's Pass, believing that the Wendigo still roams those woods, luring in the lost and the weak. 20. The Cursed Winter of 1911. In the winter of 1911, a series of brutal killings shook a small village near Lake Abitibi, Quebec. The victims were all found in the forest, their bodies savagely mutilated, with chunks of flesh missing as though they had been devoured. The villagers initially suspected a pack of wolves, but the nature of the injuries and the sheer violence of the attacks pointed to something far more malevolent. An old hunter, known only as Old Man Levesque, warned the villagers that they were dealing with a Wendigo. He spoke of an ancient curse, one that appeared in the dead of winter when hunger was at its peak. The creature, he said, was drawn to the scent of fear and desperation, preying on those who wandered too far from safety. Despite Levesque's warnings, the village sent out a hunting party to track down the creature responsible for the killings. Days later, only one man returned, Pierre Dubois. Pierre was found wandering the outskirts of the village, disoriented and covered in blood. When questioned, he muttered incoherently about eyes in the dark and something that moved too fast. He claimed that the Wendigo had taken the others, dragging them into the forest one by one, feasting on their bodies before his eyes. Pierre's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He refused to eat and became consumed by paranoia, convinced the Wendigo was coming for him. He disappeared a week later, his cabin found empty except for a single bloody handprint on the wall. The killings stopped soon after, but the village was never the same. To this day, descendants of the village speak of the cursed winter of 1911, warning anyone who listens not to venture into the woods when the hunger of winter begins to set in. 21. The Wendigo in Denali National Park. In 1978, a group of 3 friends went on a hiking expedition through Denali National Park in Alaska. They were experienced hikers, well prepared for the harsh conditions of the Alaskan wilderness. What they didn't anticipate, however, was encountering something far beyond the realm of nature. The first sign of trouble came on the second night of their trip. As they set up camp near a frozen river, they noticed a strange silence settling over the area. There were no animal sounds, no wind, just an unnatural stillness. That night, one of the friends, Chris, woke up to a distant sound, a low, raspy breathing. When he looked outside the tent, he saw a figure standing near the tree line, impossibly tall and thin, with glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight. Chris tried to wake the others, but by the time they got out of the tent, the figure was gone. The next day, they found strange tracks near their campsite, huge, clawed prints that seemed to appear and disappear at random. Over the next few days, the group experienced a growing sense of unease. They felt as though they were being followed, though they never saw the creature again. One night, Chris vanished from the campsite. His friends searched for him through the night, but found no trace of him. The only sign that he had ever been there was his backpack, torn open and covered in blood. Rescue teams scoured the area for weeks, but Chris was never found. The remaining 2 hikers made it out of the park, but both were traumatized by the experience. They spoke of seeing shadows moving through the trees, of feeling watched by something with an insatiable hunger. Local Alaskan tribes have long spoken of a creature similar to the Wendigo that stalks the forests and mountains, especially in the deep winter months when food is scarce and people are most vulnerable. Those who have survived encounters with this entity say it is not just a creature. It is a curse that spreads madness, hunger, and despair wherever it goes. 22. The Wendigo encounter of Mount Huron. In 1955, a man named Samuel Pierce embarked on a solo expedition to climb Mount Huron in Colorado. Samuel was an experienced climber known for tackling difficult ascents in harsh conditions. He was well prepared for the journey, but what he encountered on that mountain was beyond anything he could have imagined. Samuel's journal, found years later in an old cabin halfway up the mountain, details his experience. The first few entries describe typical hiking conditions: cold winds, rugged terrain, and sparse wildlife. But as Samuel ascended higher, his entries took a darker turn. He began to feel as though something was watching him, following him as he made his way up the mountain. One night, Samuel wrote about hearing strange noises outside his tent, scraping sounds, followed by a low guttural growl. When he investigated, he found nothing but strange tracks in the snow, leading away from his camp. The next day, he encountered something even more terrifying. He saw a figure in the distance, tall and emaciated, moving with unnatural speed across the snow-covered landscape. Samuel wrote that the creature appeared to be following him, always keeping its distance but never losing sight of him. The higher he climbed, the more often he saw it. The final entry in his journal is scrawled in shaky handwriting. It's close. I can feel it. I'm not alone up here. Rescue teams found Samuel's tent shredded and his gear scattered across the mountain. His body was never recovered, though the journal was found neatly placed inside the abandoned cabin. The tracks leading up to the cabin disappeared into the snow, but those who read his journal believe that Samuel had encountered the Wendigo, drawn by his isolation and the growing desperation that accompanies solitude in the wilderness. 23. The Wendigo at Boundary Waters. In 1997, a pair of avid outdoorsmen, Ron and Luke, ventured into the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, a remote and sprawling wilderness region in northern Minnesota. The trip was supposed to last a week, with plans for canoeing, fishing, and camping. The wilderness was known for its stunning beauty, but also for its eerie isolation. After 3 days of paddling deep into the Boundary Waters, they decided to set up camp near a small, remote lake. That night, as they sat by the fire, they noticed how unnaturally quiet the forest had become. There were no animal sounds, no wind rustling the trees, just an oppressive silence. Around midnight, they heard something strange, low growls, almost like a human voice but distorted, coming from the woods. They initially thought it might be a bear, but the sound was unlike anything they'd ever heard before. As the growling grew closer, they noticed movement in the trees. A figure, tall and gaunt, its eyes reflecting the glow of the campfire. The figure seemed to stalk them, staying just out of sight, its limbs moving with unnatural, jerky motions. Terrified, the two men grabbed their gear and paddled across the lake in the dark, desperate to escape whatever was out there. They set up a second camp on the opposite shore, hoping to put distance between themselves and the creature. But the growling continued throughout the night, following them no matter how far they paddled. In the morning, they found strange, elongated footprints near their campsite, leading from the lake's edge into the forest. Neither man was willing to continue the trip. They abandoned their plans and paddled back towards civilization, cutting their trip short by several days. To this day, they refuse to return to the Boundary Waters. Locals in northern Minnesota say the Wendigo has long been sighted in the area, especially during the winter months when the wilderness grows deadly quiet and the cold takes hold of everything. The eerie silence that precedes a Wendigo sighting has become a well-known omen, signaling the approach of the Humbree spirit. 24. The tragedy of the lost hunters. In 1932, 2 hunters went missing near the Lake Nipigon area in Ontario, Canada. Edward and Leonard, both seasoned outdoorsmen, had ventured deep into the woods for what was supposed to be a simple hunting trip. However, as the days passed with no sign of their return, a search party was sent out to find them. The search team found their camp several days later, but it was completely abandoned. The campfire had long since burned out, and their gear was scattered as if the men had left in a hurry. There were strange markings around the camp, deep claw marks on the trees, as though something had circled the campsite repeatedly. What disturbed the search party the most, however, were the tracks leading away from the camp. They found the hunters' footprints heading into the forest, but alongside them were much larger, inhuman prints, elongated and clawed, with a stride far longer than any human could manage. The tracks eventually led to a small clearing where they stopped abruptly, as if the hunters and whatever had been following them had vanished into thin air. The men were never found, and their disappearance remains a mystery to this day. But those familiar with the stories of the Wendigo believe that the hunters fell victim to the creature's curse. The deep forests of Ontario, especially around Lake Nipigon, have long been associated with Wendigo sightings. Locals say that in the dead of winter, you can hear the wind howling like a distant scream, as though the Wendigo is still hunting for its next prey. 25. The Wendigo of Northern Alaska. In 1967, a small village in northern Alaska experienced a series of strange and terrifying events that left the community shaken. It began when a local hunter named Isaac disappeared during a blizzard. Isaac was known for his skill in tracking and surviving the harsh Alaskan winters, so when he didn't return after several days, his family knew something was wrong. A search party was formed, but Isaac's body was never found. His tracks led deep into the wilderness, but eventually they disappeared altogether, as if he had been swallowed by the snow. Over the next few weeks, others in the village began reporting strange sightings, a tall, gaunt figure lurking at the edge of the village, watching from the shadows. At night, the villagers heard eerie howls coming from the forest, unlike anything they had ever heard before. It was said that Isaac's widow had dreams of a pale figure with glowing eyes calling to her from the woods, urging her to join him. The dreams grew more vivid, and soon she began to fall ill, refusing to eat, her body wasting away as though something was draining the life from her. The village elders believed that Isaac had been taken by the Wendigo, his spirit corrupted by the creature's hunger, and that the Wendigo was now trying to claim his wife. In a desperate attempt to save her, the village held a traditional cleansing ceremony, hoping to banish the Wendigo's influence. Though the ceremony seemed to work, and Isaac's widow recovered, the village was never the same. To this day, the people of that village still speak of the Wendigo with hushed voices, warning their children not to wander into the woods alone, especially during the long, dark winters. They say the creature is still out there, waiting for the next soul to claim. 26. The Wendigo of the Appalachian Trail. In 1983, two hikers, Amy and Rachel, were trekking along the Appalachian Trail in the mountains of Virginia. The pair were experienced hikers and had planned a 5-day trip through a particularly remote stretch of the trail. On the 4th day, something happened that neither of them would ever forget. As they hiked through a dense, fog-covered section of the trail, they began to feel uneasy. The forest was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. That night, as they set up camp, the silence continued, no wind, no birds, no sounds of the forest. Just an eerie, oppressive stillness. Around midnight, Annie woke up to the sound of movement outside their tent. At first, she thought it was an animal, but when she peered out, she saw a figure standing just beyond the firelight. It was tall and thin, its skin stretched tight over its bones, with hollow, glowing eyes. The figure moved with jerky, unnatural movements, its long arms reaching toward the tent, as if drawn to the warmth of the fire. Amy screamed, waking Rachel, and the two women grabbed their gear and fled into the night. They didn't stop running until they reached a nearby ranger station the next morning, exhausted and terrified. The rangers searched the area where they had camped, but found no signs of the creature, only deep claw marks on the trees and strange footprints leading deeper into the woods. Locals in the area have long told stories of a creature that roams the Appalachian Trail, especially during the colder months. While most assume the legends refer to Bigfoot, others who have experienced the creature firsthand believe it's something far worse, something ancient and hungry, a Wendigo drawn to those who venture too far into its domain. 27. The mysterious disappearance of the Montague family. In the winter of 1925, the Montague family, Henry, his wife Clara, and their 2 children, moved to a remote cabin near the Great Slave Lake in Canada's Northwest Territories. Henry, a trapper, was looking forward to a quiet winter, away from the rest of the world, where he could focus on his work. But by the end of that winter, the Montague family would vanish without a trace. Neighbors, who lived miles away, hadn't heard from the Montagues in weeks. Concerned, they made the treacherous journey through the snow to check on the family. When they arrived, they'd found the cabin empty, the door wide open. Inside, there were signs of a struggle, furniture overturned, dishes smashed, but no blood, no bodies. The most disturbing part, however, was the footprints leading away from the cabin. They were not the footprints of a man, woman, or child, but large, clawed prints that circled the cabin and led off into the wilderness. Search parties combed the area, but the family was never found. Locals believe that the Wendigo had claimed the Montague family, drawn by the isolation and the desperation that comes with a long, hard winter. The cabin remains abandoned to this day, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. Those who pass by it say they feel a deep sense of dread, as though the Wendigo still lingers, waiting for more souls to fall into its icy grasp. 28. The Wendigo of Desolation Wilderness. In 2010, a group of 4 friends went on a backpacking trip to Desolation Wilderness in Northern California. This rugged, remote area near Lake Tahoe was known for its isolation and beauty, but it was also a place where few dared to camp in the winter. Despite the freezing conditions, the group wanted to experience the snow-covered mountains. For the first 2 days, their trip went as planned. But on the 3rd night, things took a dark turn. While gathered around the campfire, the group began to hear what they thought was the wind howling. But as the minutes passed, they realized it wasn't wind at all. It was a low, eerie wail, like the sound of a woman crying. The sound seemed to be getting closer. One of the friends, Mike, decided to investigate. He grabbed his flashlight and ventured out into the trees. Moments later, the group heard him scream. They rushed after him, but by the time they reached the spot where he had been, Mike was gone. His footprints ended abruptly, and there was no sign of a struggle, just silence. The remaining friends, terrified, tried to call for help, but their phones had no signal. They stayed awake all night, huddled together by the fire, watching the trees. They could hear footsteps in the snow around them, but no matter where they pointed their lights, they saw nothing. At dawn, they packed up and made their way back to the trailhead. Mike was never found, and authorities could offer no explanation for his disappearance. The friends are convinced that something unnatural took him, a Wendigo, drawn to the isolation and the cold. To this day, they refuse to talk about what they saw that night, haunted by the memory of their friend's screams echoing through the wilderness. 29. The Winter Cabin Incident. In 1979, a young couple named Peter and Linda decided to spend their honeymoon in a remote cabin in the Rocky Mountains. The cabin had been in Peter's family for generations, and though it was miles from the nearest town, they were excited to spend their first winter together there. On their second night, a blizzard swept in, trapping them in the cabin. The snow piled up so quickly that they couldn't leave, and within hours, they were cut off from the outside world. At first, they were content to wait out the storm, but by the 3rd day, strange things began to happen. Linda noticed scratches on the outside of the cabin, long, deep marks as though something with claws had been trying to get in. Peter insisted it was just the wind blowing branches against the cabin, but Linda wasn't convinced. That night, they heard heavy footsteps circling the cabin, accompanied by a low, rumbling growl. Peter grabbed his rifle and went outside to investigate, but found nothing except strange, elongated footprints leading away into the trees. The storm had made it impossible to leave, so they were forced to stay put, even as the growling continued each night. On the 5th night, Linda woke to the sound of something scraping against the window. When she looked out, she saw a tall, gaunt figure standing just beyond the tree line, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs were unnaturally long. Linda screamed, and Peter rushed to her side, but by the time he looked outside, the figure was gone. The next morning, they found the same strange footprints circling the cabin. They knew they had to leave, but the snow made it impossible to travel. After 2 more nights of terror, the storm finally broke, and the couple made a desperate dash to the nearest town. They later learned from the locals that the area had long been associated with sightings of the Wendigo, a creature that roams the mountains during the harshest winters, preying on those who are trapped by the snow. Peter and Linda never returned to the cabin, and to this day, they believe the Wendigo was stalking them, waiting for the moment they would become weak enough to claim. 30. The Wendigo on the icy shores of Lake Superior. In the winter of 1936, 2 fishermen, Jacob and Harold, set out on Lake Superior near Thunder Bay, Ontario. The lake was partially frozen, and the men hoped to catch fish beneath the ice. They had heard the old stories about the Wendigo, but like most, they dismissed them as superstitions. On the 3rd day of their trip, they noticed something odd. There were no animal tracks near the shore, no signs of life at all. Even the fish seemed to have disappeared. The lake was eerily silent, and the air felt heavy with an unnatural chill. That night, as they camped by the shore, they heard something strange, faint, high-pitched wails carried on the wind like a cry for help. But when they went to investigate, they found nothing. The sound returned the next night, louder this time, and accompanied by footsteps crunching in the snow. When Jacob shone his lantern toward the sound, he saw a tall, emaciated figure standing on the ice, watching them from a distance. Panicked, the men retreated to their tent, but the figure didn't leave. It circled their camp all night, its glowing eyes never leaving them. The next morning, they found large, clawed footprints in the snow, leading away from their camp and back onto the ice. The fishermen decided to cut their trip short, but as they packed up, Harold became disoriented and started acting strangely. He muttered about the hunger, claiming that something was calling to him from the lake. Before Jacob could stop him, Harold ran onto the ice and disappeared into the fog. Jacob searched for him for hours, but found no trace of his friend, just more of those strange, clawed footprints leading deeper into the frozen lake. Harold's body was never found. Locals believe that the Wendigo, drawn by the isolation and the freezing conditions, had claimed him, just as it had claimed others who had ventured too far into the wilderness. To this day, people in Thunder Bay still tell stories of the Wendigo that haunts the icy shores of Lake Superior, waiting for the next soul to lure into the cold. 31. The disappearance of Andrew Tanner. In 1984, Andrew Tanner, a forestry worker in northern Saskatchewan, vanished while surveying a remote area of dense forest. Andrew was known for his love of the outdoors, and his job required him to travel deep into the wilderness for weeks at a time. But when he failed to return after a routine survey trip, his colleagues grew concerned. A search party was quickly organized, and after several days of searching, they found Andrew's campsite. His tent was torn open, his gear scattered, but there was no sign of a struggle. What puzzled the searchers the most were the tracks leading away from the campsite, large, clawed footprints that seemed to follow Andrew's trail into the forest. A few days later, the search party made another chilling discovery. In a small clearing, they found Andrew's axe embedded in a tree, and nearby, the ground was stained with blood. But again, there was no body. Only more of those strange, inhuman footprints, circling the clearing as if something had been stalking Andrew. The search was eventually called off, and Andrew was presumed dead. However, locals who were familiar with the legends of the Wendigo believed that he had been taken by the creature. The area where Andrew disappeared is known for its harsh winters and dense, impenetrable forest, perfect territory for the Wendigo to hunt. Those who live near the region still tell stories of Andrew Tanner's disappearance, warning that the Wendigo still roams the forest, feeding on those who wander too far from safety. They say that if you listen carefully on cold, still nights, you can hear Andrew's axe striking the trees, a distant echo of his last stand against the creature. 32. The Wendigo at the old logging camp. In 1950, a group of loggers working in the remote forests of British Columbia experienced something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The camp was located deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, and the loggers were used to being isolated for weeks at a time. One winter, strange things began happening around the camp. Tools would go missing, only to be found later in strange places. The men heard strange noises at night, low growls and distant screams that seemed to come from deep in the forest. At first, they dismissed it as animals, but as the noises grew more frequent, they began to fear something else was out there. One night, one of the men, Paul, went out to check on the logging equipment. He didn't return. His fellow loggers searched for him the next day, but all they found were his footprints leading into the forest, followed by larger, clawed tracks. The tracks ended in a clearing where the snow was stained with blood. Over the next few days, more of the men began seeing a tall, gaunt figure lurking in the trees, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The figure would watch them from a distance, never coming close, but always there, just beyond the firelight. Terrified, the loggers packed up and left the camp, abandoning the site. When they returned in the spring, they found the remains of Paul's clothing, torn and blood-stained, scattered in the clearing where he had disappeared. The camp was never reopened, and the area was left to nature. Locals believe that the Wendigo had been stalking the camp, drawn by the isolation and the fear of the men. Even today, few dare to venture into that part of the forest, knowing that the Wendigo still roams the woods, waiting for its next victim. 33. The Wendigo of Yukon Territory. In 1976, a survivalist named Eric Thorne traveled to the Yukon Territory in northern Canada to test his skills in one of the most remote, unforgiving environments on Earth. Eric had survived several winters in the wilderness before, but this time something far worse than cold or hunger would test him. Eric set up camp near an abandoned mining town deep in the Yukon, miles away from civilization. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. He hunted, built shelter, and navigated the harsh landscape. But one night, as the temperature dropped far below freezing, Eric began to hear strange sounds. Footsteps in the snow, but no animals or humans were nearby. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the sounds continued, growing louder each night. Then came the scratching at his cabin door, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly human-like. Eric ventured outside with his rifle, only to find large, clawed footprints around the cabin. The prints didn't resemble any animal he had seen, but the sheer size and depth of them suggested something far bigger than any predator in the area. On the third night, Eric woke up to the sound of growling right outside his window. He grabbed his rifle and peered through the frosted glass. Standing just at the edge of the firelight was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It stood motionless, watching him. Panicked, Eric fired a shot, but the creature didn't move. Instead, it let out a long, bone-chilling scream before disappearing into the forest. That night, Eric didn't sleep. The following morning, he packed up and left the cabin, making the long trek back to civilization. Locals told him he had encountered the Wendigo, a creature drawn to isolated people during the long, brutal winters of the north. Eric never returned to the Yukon, and he never spoke of the encounter again. But those who live near the old mining town say the Wendigo still roams the area, waiting for the next lone traveler. 34. The Wendigo on the Frostline Trail. In 1985, a hiker named Sarah vanished while trekking along the Frostline Trail, a remote hiking path in northern Colorado. Sarah was an experienced backpacker, known for her endurance and knowledge of wilderness survival. When she didn't return from her trip, search teams combed the trail for weeks, but no trace of her was found. Until a single journal appeared at an old campsite. The journal, which was later confirmed to belong to Sarah, told a horrifying story. She wrote that she had been hiking through the mountains when she started feeling like she was being followed. At first, she chalked it up to paranoia, but over time, the feeling grew stronger. Every night, she would hear footsteps around her campsite, soft at first, then louder, as though whatever was out there was growing bolder. One night, Sarah woke to the sound of something sniffing around her tent. The next morning, she found strange, clawed footprints leading away from her camp. She wrote that the footprints were not animal, too large and too human-like. As she continued along the trail, the footsteps followed her. Every night, the creature came closer, its presence more pronounced. In the last few pages of the journal, Sarah described seeing a tall, gaunt figure standing in the trees, its glowing eyes watching her. She wrote that the creature was trying to drive her mad, to make her lose herself in the wilderness. The final entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. It's not human. It's hungry. Sarah's body was never found, and the journal remains the only clue to her disappearance. The locals believe the Wendigo had followed her, stalking her through the mountains, waiting for her to succumb to exhaustion and fear. 35. The Wendigo in the Black Forest. In 1991, a logger named Jacob Palmer was working in the dense Black Forest near Alberta, Canada. It was a cold, brutal winter, and the logging crew was often isolated for weeks at a time, miles from the nearest town. During one particularly harsh stretch, Jacob began hearing strange noises in the forest, distant cries that sounded almost human, but distorted like someone was calling for help. He asked the other loggers about the noises, but none of them had heard anything. Jacob grew increasingly uneasy as the sounds grew louder, closer each night. One evening, as he was returning to camp, he saw something at the edge of the clearing. It was a figure, tall and skeletal, its limbs unnaturally long, watching him from the tree line. When Jacob tried to approach, the figure vanished into the forest with an unnatural speed. Shaken, he returned to camp, but the sight of the creature haunted him. Over the next few nights, the figure returned, always staying just out of reach, its glowing eyes following Jacob wherever he went. On the fourth night, Jacob woke to the sound of something heavy moving outside his tent. He grabbed his axe and stepped out into the freezing night air. The creature stood there, just a few feet away, its long, bony fingers extended toward him. Jacob swung the axe, but the creature moved faster than any human could, disappearing into the darkness. The next day, he packed up and left the logging camp, abandoning the job altogether. He told no one of the encounter, but he knew what he had seen. The Black Forest has long been associated with Wendigo legends, and the locals believe that the creature still roams those woods, preying on those who wander too far into the forest's cold, shadowy depths. 36. The Wendigo in the Huron Wilderness. In 1939, a fur trapper named Thomas Blake disappeared in the Huron Wilderness of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Thomas was well known in the area, having trapped in those woods for years without incident. But during one particularly severe winter, he vanished without a trace. His family organized a search party, and after days of scouring the frozen landscape, they found his campsite. The camp was in disarray, his gear scattered, his traps destroyed, and the snow around the camp was stained with blood. The searchers followed a set of footprints leading away from the camp, but what they found disturbed them deeply. The footprints were not human. They were large, clawed prints leading deep into the forest, where they abruptly stopped in a clearing. The searchers could find no further trace of Thomas or any sign of what had happened to him. But the strange prints led them to believe that something inhuman, had taken him. Old legends from the local Ojibwa people spoke of the Wendigo, a creature that haunted the wilderness, especially during times of famine and extreme cold. The Wendigo was said to be a spirit of insatiable hunger, capable of possessing and consuming those who wandered too far into the wilderness. Thomas Blake was never seen again, but locals continue to tell stories of a gaunt, skeletal figure seen in the woods, its eyes glowing in the darkness. The Huron Wilderness is vast and desolate, and those who enter it are always reminded of the Wendigo's presence. 37. The Wendigo of the Great Bear Rainforest. In 2004, a group of researchers studying the wildlife in the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia encountered something they could not explain. The group, consisting of 5 scientists, had set up camp deep within the forest, miles from any human settlement. Their mission was to study the behavior of local wildlife during the winter months. One night, as they sat around their campfire, they began hearing strange noises, growls and snarls, like an animal in distress. But the noises didn't sound like any animal they were familiar with. They decided to investigate, thinking it might be a wounded bear or wolf. As they ventured into the forest, they noticed something unsettling. The trees around them were marked with deep claw marks far too high to have been made by any bear. And then they saw it, a figure, tall and emaciated, moving through the trees with unnerving speed. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The group retreated to their camp, but the creature followed them, circling their tents throughout the night. They could hear it breathing, hear its footsteps crunching in the snow, but they never saw it up close again. The next morning, they packed up and left the forest, cutting their research trip short. When they reported the encounter to local authorities, they were met with silence. The indigenous communities in the area, however, believed the scientists had encountered the Wendigo, a spirit that haunted the forests and mountains during the winter months, drawn to the scent of fear and isolation. The Great Bear Rainforest is a place of deep mystery, and even today, those who venture into its depths are warned to be cautious, especially during the long, cold winters when the Wendigo is said to be at its most powerful.